cabin had always been a place of joy for my family. Nestled in the snowy wilderness of Colorado, it was a relic of my parents' love for skiing and the outdoors. But even as a child, I could sense something off about the place, something that went beyond its creaking floors and peeling paint. It was as if the house itself was watching us, waiting. 15 years ago, during a blizzard that seemed to swallow the world whole, my brother Josh and I ventured out into the storm. We were kids, invincible in our snowsuits, eager to play our favorite game. A snowball fight with makeshift forts and a jewel to steal. Josh, always the strategist, chose the neighboring property for his base. It was a sprawling, empty lot with a house that stood dark and silent, its windows like hollow eyes. The owners were never around, and we treated it as an extension of our playground. But that day, something was different. I waited at our fort, shivering despite my layers, for Josh's whistle to signal the start of the game. Minutes stretched into an eternity, and the silence became unnerving. The wind howled, and the snow fell so thickly that it felt like the world was closing in. Finally, I decided to go after him, choosing the road over the woods. The woods were too dark, too alive with shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. As I approached the neighbor's property, I noticed something strange. Josh's fort was there, but he wasn't. The snow around it was disturbed, as if he'd been dragged away. My heart began to race, but before I could call out, a voice cut through the storm. "Excuse me, are you looking for your brother?" I turned to see an older woman standing in the doorway of the neighbor's house. Her smile was too wide, her eyes too bright. She beckoned me closer, her voice sweet but laced with something I couldn't place. Fear prickled at the back of my neck, but I took a step forward, my boots crunching in the snow. Then I saw it. In the upstairs window, a figure stood watching me. Half of their face was obscured by a black beanie, the other half hidden by the edge of the window. For a moment, I thought it was Josh playing a trick on me. But the figure didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. The woman's smile faltered as I hesitated. "Come inside, dear," she said, her voice sharper now. "It's cold out here." I took a step back, my breath coming in short, visible puffs. That's when I noticed the footprints leading to the house. They weren't just Josh's, they were his, doubled over, as if he'd gone to the door and then turned back. But why would he go inside? Before I could process it, I heard heavy footsteps from within the house. They were coming from upstairs, slow and deliberate, like someone, or something, was descending. The woman's smile vanished, replaced by a look of panic. She shouted something in a language I didn't understand, and I bolted. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me, the snow pulling at my boots like hands trying to drag me down. I didn't look back, not until I reached the safety of our driveway. My dad was there, his face pale, and Josh stood beside him, wide-eyed and trembling. "There were people in the house," Josh stammered. "They told me to come inside." My dad grabbed a rifle and marched down to the neighbor's property, leaving us with our mom. When he returned, his face was grim. The house was locked, he said. No one answered the door, but the back door had been wide open. The snow inside melted as if someone had just stepped in. The owners, when contacted, insisted the house had been empty all weekend. The police found nothing during their search, but my dad swore he saw footprints leading into the woods, footprints that didn't match any human shape. We never played on that property again. Even now, as an adult, I can't shake the image of that figure in the window or the sound of those heavy footsteps. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear the woman's voice calling out to me, inviting me inside. Years later, I hadn't been back to the cabin in over a decade. Life had taken me far from Colorado, but when my dad called to say he was finally tearing the old place down, I felt a pull I couldn't ignore. I had to see it one last time. The drive up the mountain was surreal. The road was the same, but the trees seemed taller, the shadows deeper. When I arrived, the cabin looked smaller than I remembered, its once imposing frame now hunched and weathered. My dad was already there, overseeing the demolition crew. "You sure you want to do this?" I asked him, standing in the doorway. He nodded, but his eyes were distant. "It's time. This place, it's seen better days." As the crew worked, I wandered the property, memories flooding back with every step. I found myself drawn to the neighbor's house, now a crumbling shell of what it once was. The windows were boarded up, the roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. But as I stood there, something caught my eye. A light flickered in one of the upstairs windows. My breath hitched. It couldn't be. The house had been abandoned for years. I told myself it was just the sun reflecting off the glass. But deep down, I knew better. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. And then I saw her. The woman from all those years ago stood in the doorway, her smile just as wide, her eyes just as bright. She beckoned me closer, her voice carrying on the wind. "Welcome back, dear." I turned and ran, my dad's voice calling after me. But as I reached the safety of the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I looked back at the neighbor's house, and there in the upstairs window was the figure from my childhood. Only this time it wasn't half hidden. It was staring right at me, its face twisted into a grotesque smile. The demolition crew found the bodies the next day, buried beneath the neighbor's house. Two of them, a woman and a child, their faces frozen in eternal screams. The police said they'd been there for decades, but I knew better. They'd been waiting for us. The cabin had always felt like a second home to me, even though it was old and creaky. A relic of my parents' skiing obsession. Nestled deep in the Colorado wilderness, it was the kind of place where the snow seemed to fall heavier and the nights grew darker than anywhere else. But when I was 8, during a blizzard that shut down the entire mountain, something happened that changed the way I saw the cabin and the world forever. My brother Josh and I were inseparable back then. He was 3 years older, and I idolized him. That day, despite the storm raging outside, we begged our parents to let us play in the snow. They relented as long as we stayed close to the house. But Josh had other plans. "Let's play the jewel game," he said, his eyes gleaming with mischief. It was our favorite. We'd build snow forts, hide a jewel, a giant snowball, and try to steal it from each other. But this time, Josh wanted to play on the neighbor's property, a sprawling lot with an old, abandoned house at the end of a long, winding driveway. The owners were never there, and the place had become our unofficial playground. I hesitated. The house had always given me the creeps, even in broad daylight. Its windows were dark and lifeless, and the front door always seemed slightly ajar, as if inviting us inside. But Josh was already halfway down the road, his laughter carried away by the wind. I had no choice but to follow. We built our forts quickly, the snow falling so fast it felt like the sky was collapsing. Josh chose a spot near the house while I stayed closer to the road. The rules were simple. Once the whistle blew, the game would begin. But as I waited, something felt off. The wind sounded like whispers, and the snow seemed to muffle everything except the pounding of my heart. When the whistle didn't come, I grew impatient. I trudged through the snow toward Josh's fort, calling his name. But when I got there, he was gone. His fort was intact, the jewel still sitting in the center, but there was no sign of him. Panic set in as I scanned the property, my breath coming in short, visible bursts. That's when I heard it. A faint giggle, high-pitched and unnatural, coming from the direction of the house. I turned and saw a figure standing in the doorway, a little girl no older than me, dressed in a tattered winter coat. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were black as coal. She smiled at me, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that made my stomach churn. "Josh is inside," she said, her voice echoing as if it were coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "He's waiting for you." I froze. Every instinct told me to run, but I couldn't leave Josh. I took a step forward, then another, until I was standing at the threshold of the house. The little girl stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. The interior was dark and smelled of mildew, the air so cold it burned my lungs. I called out for Josh, but there was no answer, only the sound of footsteps creaking on the floor above. I climbed the stairs, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. At the top, I found a hallway lined with doors, all of them closed except one. Inside, Josh was sitting on the floor, staring at the wall. He didn't turn when I called his name. He just kept staring, his face blank, his eyes empty. "Josh," I whispered, stepping closer. That's when I noticed the shadows moving on the wall, twisting and writhing like living things. They reached out for him, wrapping around his arms and legs, pulling him into the wall. I screamed and grabbed his hand, but it was like trying to hold on to smoke. He slipped through my fingers and disappeared, the shadows swallowing him whole. I ran. I didn't look back, not even when I heard the little girl's laughter following me down the stairs and out into the snow. I didn't stop until I reached the cabin where my parents were waiting. They didn't believe me when I told them what happened. They said Josh must have wandered off, that the storm had disoriented him. But I knew better. The police searched the property for days, but they found nothing. No sign of Josh, no evidence that anyone had been in the house. The owners, when contacted, said the place had been empty for years. But I knew the truth. Josh was gone, taken by something I couldn't explain. 15 years later, I hadn't been back to the cabin since that day. But when my dad called to say he was selling the property, I felt a pull I couldn't ignore. I had to see it one last time. The house looked smaller than I remembered, its paint peeling and its roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. But the neighbor's house was exactly the same, dark, silent, and foreboding. I stood at the edge of the property, staring at the front door, which was still slightly ajar. That's when I saw her. The little girl was standing in the doorway, her coat just as tattered, her smile just as cold. She beckoned me closer, her black eyes gleaming with malice. "You never finished the game," she said. I turned and ran, but her laughter followed me all the way back to the cabin. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the whistle, the same one Josh used to signal the start of our game. It came from the neighbor's house, faint but unmistakable. And then I heard his voice. "Your turn," Josh whispered.